So let's talk a little bit about professional memos. These are different from like an email that you would typically send. Now, back in the day, these were actually sent out on paper. A lot of times now you will see these actually sent out through email, but they will be formatted as a memo or a memorandum. So what's the difference, right? Well, memos are internal documents. Typically, they send them amongst departments or within different departments or different branches, different geographic regions. So if you work for a company like, let's say you work for Forbes and they've got tons and tons of offices all across the country, if they need to get information out about a new HR policy or something, they may send out a memo that's, titled "Attention, new update to HR policy number 5" or something like that, right? And they'll send that out to everybody. Or maybe you work within the tax research department and there's an update to one of their processes. Well, they're only going to send that to the to that particular department. They're typically not 24/7 like an email, and I say that knowing that most of the time you are going to receive these as an email, but the big difference is they are more formal than just your typical email. Hey, how you doing? Hey, you should be aware of this or something like that. These are going to be more formal. These are going to be the kind of things where if you violate a policy, HR may be like, hey, we sent a memo out about this. You should have been aware. Okay. If you have to send confidential information, so the tax research department, that would be a good example of that. They may have to send confidential information about clients back and forth. And typically you're going to want to send those in either a memo or a letter. Okay, so don't just send them in email. Some places can limit who sees these based on distribution lists, based on I know that when I worked at Mercy, we had to do this thing where we called it breaking the glass. And if we had to get into like a patient record for some reason, let's say I was auditing a patient record and I had to get into it, and they had, let's say they had a behavioral health issue and they had visited a therapist. I would have to break the glass to get into that particular portion of their record, and it would alert people that I had done that. And typically you got an email from somebody saying, why did you get in there? What was your business purpose for being in there? You work in revenue and finance. Why are you in somebody's record that has, a behavioral health issue? And so there are ways to set these up to where if somebody opened a memo like this as an attachment to an email, it would alert somebody. And they would go, oh, you don't work on this tax research team. You don't work for this with this client. What was your purpose in needing to see this information? So it is something that you can send confidential information to. So what's the same between the two? Well, you still want to use your 6 C's of business communication, and you can get this in Chapter 9 of your textbook. Hopefully some of you guys are actually utilizing that resource. You want to be clear, so you want to use specific information. You want to use direct wording, transitions, things like that. You want to be concise, so get to the point quickly, which is something I'm terrible at doing. You want to get to the point quickly, but you don't want to be rude or curt about it, right? You want to get to the point, but you want to be polite and professional. Be consistent. So if you're going to use the same terminology or the same mechanics, you're going to want to use the same treatment for all those terminologies and items. Be correct. Make sure that you verify information for accuracy. Always proofread and check your grammar. And make sure that you are sending complete information. So if you need somebody to make a decision, you want to make sure that you include all the pertinent details that they need for making a decision. You don't want somebody to make a decision based on half the information, right? And then later you present all the information, they go, oh, wait, that would have completely changed my decision. And then finally, you want to be courteous, and this means, outside of just your general politeness and all that, you also want to make sure that you're writing with your reader's viewpoint in mind, and we'll talk about that in a minute. It just means think about what do they know, are they familiar with the subject, that kind of thing. So make sure you plan your message. I know that when I'm writing out emails or memos, I spend a lot of time writing them out, rereading them, writing it out again, having somebody else look at it for me, especially if it's an email that might an email or a memo or something like that that's not going to be taken very well. You need to be aware of tone. Tone is very difficult to convey. Typically, you're not going to worry about tone too much in a memo because, like I said, they're more formal. They're usually alerts about policy, alerts about meetings, or some kind of other information. Don't want to use emoticons. That would be definitely not a good thing to do. Avoid using outdated phrases and leave out using courtesy titles in the from line. So like from Mr. or Mrs., things like that. Just give their name. And then utilize a spell check program like Grammarly or the spell check within Word or something to make sure it just helps you make sure that you're not completely butchering the English language when you send out a memo. I know that for me, there's nothing worse than getting a memo from somebody like a CFO or a VP that just has tons of grammatical errors in it. It just kind of sets the tone for that email, and you may have a different opinion of them by the end of it. So, what are some basics about a memo, right? Well, consider your purpose. Why are you writing the memo, right? Always write memos with a specific purpose in mind. This isn't just a rambling thing. There's a specific reason that you are writing the memo. Are you writing it to persuade somebody? Are you writing it to inform somebody? Typically speaking, you will be writing these to inform somebody of some kind of change or update to information. Consider your audience's perspective. That's what we talked about as far as being courteous, right? You want to make sure that you're thinking from your audience's mindset, from their perspective. Are they familiar with the topic? Do they consider you to be an authority on the topic? So, if I wrote a memo about tax research, I would not be considered an authority. I don't work in taxes. I've worked in audit. I've worked in financial statement analysis, but not taxes, right? So I would not consider myself an expert, and I would not expect somebody else to consider me an expert in that field. However, if I wrote somebody a memo about updated fraud information or updates to Yellow Book, I would expect them to consider me to be an expert on the topic because I'm a CFE. I worked in fraud for a long time. I worked with Yellow Book standards for a long time, so I'm an expert in the authority or an expert on the topic. Okay. Also, you need to consider, will this be taken as good news or bad news? It's hard to say. It just depends on what the topic is, right? So you really need to be very aware of your tone in the way that you approach sending out what you would consider to be bad news memos, right? If a company is going to be quote-unquote right-sizing, meaning they're going to be laying people off, that is not going to be taken well by a lot of people. So you have to approach that. Topic gently, okay? And that feeds into this next point of planning your message carefully, particularly when you're going to be giving bad news. So write it, read it, edit it, rewrite it, and then send it to somebody else to read and give you advice. I know that I very seldomly will just go with my first draft of something that's going to be taken as bad news. I typically have I read through it again myself, maybe change a few things, and then I'll have somebody else read through it as well and provide me some feedback and critique. So do the same thing. You should spend almost as much time, maybe more time, planning out your message and writing and rewriting, editing and proofreading than you do actually sending your message or expecting people to read it, right? Make sure your message is organized and proofread, edit, and revise your memo. I cannot stress that enough. You definitely want to be proofreading, editing, and revising. So here is the format. When you do your activity for the memo this week, when you write up your memo, even your LinkedIn memo, make sure it's in this format, right? You want to have a purpose. So your statement of purpose is going to be stated clearly. You may refer to an earlier memo or to a previous meeting or to a previous conversation, but you want to make sure that your purpose is stated clearly. And then in your message, you want to go directly to the main point of the message, right? Don't beat around the bush, just get to the point. And then finally, statement of future action. This is what I used to call a call to action. It's the way I learned it when I was in school. It's a call to action. Say, hey, I'm looking forward to hearing from you. That kind of gives them the tip, gives them, plants the seed that they're expected to respond to this, or they're expected to take some kind of action, right? So make sure that you list it out in this format, or that you write it out in this format. when you complete your memos, any activities or assignments that we do this week. So memos in the accounting profession. Generally, memos are shorter, but they can sometimes be the length of the letter. This is going to be the case with your LinkedIn memo, right? It's going to be longer than your typical memo is going to be. When you do write longer memos, remember to use formatting. So you want to have section headers. You want to use block formatting. You don't want to indent your paragraphs, all that kind of good stuff. Just make sure that you are breaking the sections up into easier to read, easier to digest portions of the memo, okay? Again, these are perceived as more formal than an email, but they're less formal than what we would send in like a letter on official letterhead and all that stuff, all that good stuff. And typically they are internal. We addressed this earlier that we see them as an attachment or the body of an email. If there is going to be confidential information in them, like I said, a lot of times you'll see these as an attachment to the email as opposed to the body of an email. That way they've got a way of tracking who has opened and looked at that memo. These are just referred to as memorandums. So if you hear the term memorandum, it's just a memo, right? So why do we use memos? Well, we use the memos to record information about a client, place it in the client's file. So like I said, if you're doing tax research, you may write a memo to the group of employees that are working for that client, and you would put it into a file. I know that at the auditor's office, we had a specific file called an A10 work paper, and this was for auditees that we audited on a regular basis. So if we audited the auditee every year or every 2 years or however often, we would create an A10 file, and it was just a memo that would give us pertinent information about the client. Well, I guess it's not a client for the state auditor's office, right? But for the auditee. So it would say things like, hey, the director or the department head of this particular department is difficult to work with or difficult to get scheduled for a meeting or whatever the case is. It just provided us information so that the new auditors, when we cycled in, would be aware of that we would know, okay, instead of asking for a meeting with this department head a week in advance, we need to start asking 2, maybe 3 weeks in advance so that we can get scheduled with them, that kind of thing. You may keep information on employees, which ones were helpful, which ones you would ignore your request, things like that, right? That was the A10, essentially. It was kind of the gossip memo. Every once in a while you would get, hey, this person was really, really rude. This person absolutely refused to work with us, that kind of thing. So memos are quick, they're inexpensive, and they provide a good record of communication. You will find that in accounting, one of the main reasons you do any form of communication is to keep a record of it, particularly if you were an auditor. You want to keep records, and memos are a good way of doing that. This is still applicable until 2024. There is business writing on the CPA exam. Okay, so in the BEC section of the CPA exam, you're required to complete some written tasks. They're about 15% of your score, and it's going to change with the CPA evolution, right? This won't exist anymore, really, at least not in the format that we're familiar with right now once BEC leaves. But the hope is that all of you are taking your BEC exams prior to the CPA evolution. So you'll get a situation, they'll request a response, and it provides instructions. Really, my experience with these when I've studied and things like that has been that they don't provide you anything other than a question in demographics. They can be challenging. Okay, so they're going to say, we expect this, right? They require that you use a memo or a letter format to respond. They can be challenging. I know that when I took my BEC review course during my graduate program, that these were very challenging, and they are very subjective, right? You get graded on your technical content and writing skills, so you're going to be graded on both. So you've got to know the technical aspects of it, and you've also got to be able to write well, and you've got to be able to format it well. So just be aware that this is still a thing until BEC goes away. You always want to cite your sources appropriately. We'll discuss citations as we get further into the class. There will be some research, some presentation, a data analytics project that we'll do, and you'll be expected to cite your sources. General rule for this class, though, is that if you cite your source well enough, that myself or the GAs can easily locate the article, the picture, whatever it is. That's usually good enough. However, for the more formal assignments like the FASB ASC research memo or letter, your group presentations, your data analytics presentation, I will expect more formal citations, but we will talk about those as we get there. You want to minimize the white space in the document, so that includes spaces between sections, margins, around any graphics, and you want to utilize your white space efficiently. So if you do put breaks in between sections, it helps the readers consume the content a little more easily. It helps people understand, oh, we're moving from one subject to another here, right? Don't forget that you can utilize formatting such as lists and tables for information that is difficult to interpret. I definitely, especially in your data analytics project, will expect you to be using some form of data visualization. And you can use those inside of a memo as well. So you'll want to use single spacing for your memos, not double spacing. It just looks cleaner, more professional. And that is really it on memos. So if you got any questions, comments, concerns, anything like that, feel free to contact me and I will do my best to answer your questions.